The morning David Morrison discovered his father was a Soviet spy, snow fell across suburban Philadelphia with the kind of relentless silence that precedes catastrophe. It was December 15th, 1964, 3 weeks before Christmas, and the 18-year-old had climbed into the attic of their modest colonial home, searching for holiday decorations. Instead, wedged behind a loose board beneath the eaves, his fingers found a leather satchel that would shatter everything he believed about his family. The documents spilled across the dusty floorboards like evidence at a crime scene. Soviet passports bearing his father's photograph but different names. Letters written in Cyrillic script. Photographs of William Morrison, the man David had called father for 18 years, standing in Red Square, wearing the uniform of a KGB officer. Training manuals on surveillance, dead drops, and radio transmission techniques. Bank records showing payments from numbered accounts. And beneath it all, a birth certificate for the real William Morrison, dated 1922, with a death certificate stapled behind it from 1925. The child had died at 3 years old. David's hands trembled as the implications crystallized with horrible clarity. The man downstairs, preparing for another day at the insurance company where he'd worked for 15 years, was not William Morrison. The gentle father who had taught him to throw a baseball, who helped with homework every night, who spoke with a faint accent he claimed came from growing up with German immigrant grandparents. This man was a stranger. A foreign agent who had stolen a dead child's identity and built an entire American life on that foundation. The training documents revealed the scope of the deception. Code names, contact protocols, mission objectives, focused on industrial espionage and political intelligence gathering. Maps of Philadelphia, with locations marked, including defense contractors where several of his father's friends worked. Lists of American citizens with notations in Russian. Everything methodically organized, professionally executed, spanning more than 2 decades. David sat in the dusty attic as the winter light faded, holding a photograph of his father in Red Square. The man in the image looked younger, harder, nothing like the warm father who had raised him. This stranger wore the confident expression of someone who belonged in that alien world of state secrets and ideological warfare. The contrast with the gentle insurance salesman who coached Little League on weekends felt like looking at 2 completely different people. The psychological impact hit him in waves. Every family memory now carried the poison of deception. His father's careful questions about David's teachers, his interest in which friends had parents working at local defense plants, his subtle encouragement when David expressed interest in journalism, all of it suddenly seemed calculated, purposeful. The loving father had been simultaneously gathering intelligence on the community that had welcomed them. When he heard his father's voice calling up from the kitchen, "David, dinner's ready," the normalcy of it felt obscene. How many times had this man sat at their dinner table asking about David's day while secretly transmitting information to Soviet handlers? How many neighbors had confided in William Morrison, trusting the friendly insurance man with personal details that might have found their way into KGB files? David Morrison faced a choice that no 18-year-old should have to make. The man who had raised him, who had been present for every important moment of his life, was an enemy agent. And David was, perhaps, the only person positioned to stop him. The weight of that knowledge settled on his shoulders like a physical burden as he carefully returned the documents to their hiding place, knowing that his next decision would destroy his family forever. The enemy had been living in their home for 24 years. William Morrison had arrived in Philadelphia in February 1940, during one of the worst winter storms in the city's history. The narrative he presented to immigration authorities was carefully crafted. A refugee from Nazi persecution, his family killed in the bombing of Hamburg, carrying only a suitcase and identity papers that had somehow survived the destruction of his neighborhood. The story resonated with immigration officials dealing with thousands of European refugees and William Morrison became one more tragic case processed through the system. The real William Morrison had died of pneumonia in 1925 at age 3, buried in a small cemetery in Lancaster County. His death certificate gathered dust in county records, while his birth certificate remained active in state files, a bureaucratic gap that Soviet intelligence had identified and exploited. The KGB had spent months researching deceased American children, looking for identities that could be assumed without immediate detection. Young deaths were ideal. No school records to explain, no childhood friends to encounter unexpectedly, no complex personal history to memorize and maintain. Mikhail Volkov, the man who became William Morrison, had undergone 2 years of intensive preparation in Moscow. Language training until his English carried only the faintest trace of accent. Cultural indoctrination, covering everything from baseball statistics to American holiday traditions. Practice sessions where he lived the William Morrison identity for weeks at a time, never breaking character even when alone. The KGB understood that successful deep cover required more than memorizing biographical details. It demanded psychological transformation. His cover story included just enough verifiable tragedy to discourage deep investigation while explaining any cultural gaps. The refugee narrative provided an excuse for his lack of American childhood memories and his occasional uncertainty about cultural references. Immigration authorities, overwhelmed with legitimate refugees, processed his paperwork without extensive background verification. Within 3 months, William Morrison had a Social Security number, a work permit, and a room in a South Philadelphia boarding house. The integration was methodical. He found employment at a small insurance company, chosen specifically because it provided access to personal information about local residents while requiring minimal background investigation. His supervisor, impressed by William's European work ethic and attention to detail, overlooked his sometimes stilted English and occasional cultural confusion. Within a year, he had been promoted to senior claims adjuster, a position that required house visits throughout Philadelphia's suburban communities. His handlers had given him one primary mission: establish deep cover and gather intelligence on local defense industry workers. Philadelphia's proximity to military contractors made it an ideal location for industrial espionage, but the mission expanded as opportunities emerged. William's genuine charm and apparent vulnerability as a refugee opened doors throughout the community. People trusted him with personal information, professional concerns, family problems. Every confidence became potential intelligence. The loneliness of the assignment was crushing. Maintaining false identity 24 hours a day, never relaxing, never revealing authentic emotions or thoughts, created profound psychological isolation. He couldn't form genuine friendships because every relationship was potentially exploitable. He couldn't express political opinions because they might contradict his assumed identity. He existed in a state of constant performance, playing a role that grew more complex and demanding each year. By 1945, William Morrison had become indistinguishable from any other American citizen. He paid taxes, voted in elections, complained about the weather, and contributed to local charities. The performance had become so natural that sometimes even he forgot where William ended and Mikhail began. But Moscow never forgot. Regular communications continued, missions evolved, and the intelligence flowed steadily eastward. The trap was perfectly constructed, and William Morrison was both its architect and its prisoner. Margaret O'Brien had worked as a secretary at the Philadelphia Navy Yard for 3 years when she met William Morrison at a church social in the spring of 1945. The war was ending, Philadelphia was celebrating, and the handsome insurance adjuster with the tragic past seemed like exactly what her life needed. His quiet dignity and obvious vulnerability appealed to her nurturing instincts, and his careful attention to her stories about work flattery she didn't recognize as professional interest. Their courtship followed conventional patterns. Sunday dinners, movies at the local theatre, long walks through Fairmount Park, where William asked thoughtful questions about her childhood, her friends, her work at the Navy Yard. Margaret interpreted his curiosity as genuine affection. She had no way of knowing that their conversations were being mentally catalogued, that her casual mentions of personnel changes and security procedures were being transmitted to Soviet intelligence handlers through coded radio transmissions. William's marriage proposal in December 1945 represented a significant operational decision. Marriage would provide deeper community integration and enhanced cover, but it also created complications. How could he maintain intimate deception with someone who would share his daily life? How could he protect operational security while building the emotional bond necessary for a successful marriage? Moscow's guidance was clear. The marriage served intelligence purposes, but it must appear completely authentic. The wedding in February 1946 was small, but genuine in its community celebration. Margaret's family welcomed William warmly, impressed by his devotion to their daughter and moved by his refugee story. The local newspaper ran a small announcement describing the union of Margaret O'Brien, Navy Yard Secretary, and William Morrison, insurance adjuster and European refugee. The community embraced the narrative of love, conquering the hardships of war. David's birth in September 1946 created unexpected complications for the operation. Fatherhood was not part of William's training or psychological preparation. The intensity of emotion he felt holding his infant son threatened his operational discipline. For the first time since assuming the Morrison identity, he experienced genuine personal investment in his American life. The child represented something beyond his mission, something that belonged to William Morrison rather than Mikhail Volkov. Margaret proved to be an ideal intelligence asset without ever knowing it. Her work at the Navy Yard provided valuable information about personnel, procedures, and security measures. Her social connections throughout Philadelphia's defense community offered insight into contractor activities and government operations. Her trust in her husband meant she shared professional frustrations and workplace gossip without restraint, never suspecting that domestic conversations were feeding Soviet intelligence networks. William's handler, identified only as Uncle Frank to Margaret and David, visited monthly for dinner. Margaret enjoyed cooking for the older gentleman who had supposedly helped William during his difficult arrival in America. David knew Uncle Frank as a family friend who brought small gifts and asked interested questions about school. Neither realized they were watching carefully choreographed intelligence meetings where months of gathered information was passed through seemingly innocent social interaction. The family dynamic became William's greatest operational strength and his most dangerous vulnerability. His genuine love for Margaret and David provided perfect cover for his activities, but it also created emotional stakes that compromised his professional detachment. Every family milestone, every shared experience, every moment of authentic intimacy added another layer to the deception that would ultimately prove impossible to maintain. By 1950, William Morrison had achieved everything Soviet intelligence hoped for: complete community integration, productive intelligence gathering, and unassailable cover. He was a respected member of his community, a loving husband and father, and a successful American citizen. He was also, without his family's knowledge, one of the most effective deep cover agents in KGB history. The perfect American life was the perfect crime. The transformation of David Morrison from trusting son to reluctant betrayer began in his senior year of high school, months before he discovered the documents in the attic. Small inconsistencies in his father's stories had started accumulating like hairline cracks in a foundation, barely noticeable individually, but collectively suggesting structural weakness. A slip about European geography that contradicted his refugee narrative. Unfamiliarity with American cultural references that someone who'd lived in the country for 24 years should know instinctively. Brief moments when his father's English carried inflections that sounded distinctly Slavic rather than German. David had dismissed these observations as insignificant quirks until his American history teacher assigned a research project on European refugees during World War II. The assignment required interviewing family members or community members who had experienced wartime displacement. David approached his father with excitement, finally having a reason to explore the tragic story that had shaped their family's American beginning. William's reaction was unexpected. Visible discomfort, vague responses, and eventual refusal to participate in the project. The rejection puzzled David. His father had always been supportive of his academic work, proud of his son's intellectual curiosity and academic achievements. Why would he suddenly become evasive about his personal history when discussing it could help David's education? The inconsistency nagged at David throughout the fall semester, creating a small but persistent doubt about the narrative he'd accepted without question for 18 years. His father's behavior around certain news events also seemed strange. When Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev visited the United States in 1959, William had watched television coverage with unusual intensity, making knowledgeable comments about Soviet political figures that seemed inconsistent with his claimed background as a German refugee. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, his father had displayed an understanding of Soviet strategic thinking that suggested more than casual newspaper reading. These moments of unexpected expertise contradicted the image of a man who had fled European politics and embraced American life completely. David's college plans had inadvertently increased his father's anxiety. His acceptance to Temple University's journalism program meant increased exposure to investigative thinking and research techniques. William had tried to discourage the journalism path, suggesting business or engineering instead, practical fields that would provide stable careers without requiring the investigative instincts that might prove dangerous to family secrets. His unusual insistence puzzled both David and Margaret, who had always supported their son's writing talents. The most troubling incident occurred in October 1964, when David discovered his father listening to radio broadcasts late at night. When confronted, William claimed he was following international news, but David noticed the radio was tuned to shortwave frequencies that seemed to carry coded transmissions rather than news programming. His father's explanation, nostalgic interest in European broadcasts, felt inadequate and suspicious. These accumulated doubts had created a state of psychological preparation for the discovery in the attic. David's mind had already begun questioning the fundamental assumptions about his father's identity, so the physical evidence, while shocking, felt like confirmation rather than revelation. The documents provided answers to questions that had been forming subconsciously for months. The emotional impact was devastating, precisely because it made sense of previously inexplicable behavior. Every inconsistency, every moment of evasiveness, every display of unexpected knowledge suddenly fit into a coherent pattern. His father wasn't a man with an occasionally faulty memory about his past. He was a man maintaining an elaborate fiction that had required constant vigilance to protect. Standing in the attic with the evidence scattered around him, David realized he had been living with a stranger for his entire life. The man who had raised him was real, but the identity was completely fabricated. Every family tradition, every shared memory, every moment of apparent intimacy had been shadowed by deception so profound that it called into question the authenticity of every relationship David had ever known. The decision to contact the FBI consumed 3 sleepless nights, during which David Morrison wrestled with the most devastating choice of his young life. He sat at his bedroom window, watching his father shovel snow from their driveway with the same methodical care he applied to everything, and struggled to reconcile the gentle man he'd always known with the Soviet operative the evidence revealed. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could someone be simultaneously the most important person in his life and an enemy of everything he'd been raised to believe in? On December 18, 1964, David walked into the FBI field office in downtown Philadelphia, carrying a manila envelope containing photocopies of the most damaging documents from the attic. His hands shook as he approached the reception desk, knowing that the words he was about to speak would irreversibly alter the trajectory of his family's life. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, asked how she could help. David's voice cracked as he said, "I need to report a Soviet spy. He's my father." Special Agent Robert Kellerman had been investigating Soviet intelligence operations for 12 years, but he had never encountered a walk-in informant like David Morrison. The young man's obvious emotional distress was immediately apparent, but so was his determination to do what he believed was right. Kellerman recognized the gravity of the situation within minutes of David's initial statements. If the allegations proved true, this represented one of the longest-running successful deep-cover operations in FBI counterintelligence history. The initial interview lasted 4 hours. Kellerman carefully guided David through every detail of his father's suspicious behavior, every inconsistency in his stories, every moment that had seemed out of place. The agent's experience told him this wasn't a family dispute or teenage rebellion. The young man's observations were too specific, too operationally sophisticated to be fabricated. When David produced the photocopied documents, Kellerman knew immediately that they were looking at authentic Soviet intelligence materials. The psychological evaluation was crucial. The FBI needed to determine whether David Morrison was a reliable witness or a potentially compromised individual. Could a Soviet deep-cover agent's son be trusted, or might he be an unwitting part of his father's operation? Kellerman arranged for discreet background investigation while continuing to debrief David about his father's activities, associates, and behavioral patterns. The evidence David provided created an intelligence windfall. The documents revealed operational methods, communication protocols, and network connections that the FBI had been trying to understand for years. William Morrison's case files contained references to other Soviet operations, contact procedures that might lead to additional agents, and intelligence-gathering techniques that could help identify ongoing threats to national security. Kellerman explained the operational requirements clearly. David would need to return home and continue normal family life while providing the FBI with ongoing intelligence about his father's activities. This meant living as a double agent within his own family, maintaining the loving son facade while secretly documenting evidence of espionage. The psychological burden would be enormous, but David's cooperation was essential for building a legal case. The most difficult moment came when Kellerman outlined the probable outcomes. If the investigation confirmed David's allegations, his father would face arrest, trial, and almost certainly life imprisonment or execution for espionage. His mother would discover that her 20-year marriage was based on complete deception. Their comfortable middle-class life would collapse under the weight of public scandal and legal proceedings. David Morrison walked out of the FBI building carrying the weight of his family's destruction, but he also carried the knowledge that his father had been betraying American secrets for over 20 years, and that David was perhaps the only person positioned to stop him. Operation Family Tree began on December 19, 1964, with the establishment of comprehensive surveillance on William Morrison and his associates. Agent Kellerman assembled a specialized team of 12 agents trained in long-term observation techniques, understanding that they were dealing with a highly experienced professional who would detect amateur surveillance efforts. The investigation required the highest level of operational sophistication to avoid alerting their target while gathering enough evidence for successful prosecution. The FBI's first priority was confirming David's allegations through independent sources. William Morrison's employment records, tax filings, and community involvement were subjected to microscopic examination. Agents discovered subtle inconsistencies that supported David's claims, employment gaps that couldn't be explained, financial transactions that seemed inconsistent with his declared income, and social connections that appeared strategically chosen rather than naturally developed. Surveillance teams positioned themselves throughout William's daily routine. His commute to work, lunch meetings, evening activities, and weekend social interactions were monitored and documented. Within weeks, patterns emerged that confirmed sophisticated tradecraft. William's seemingly random stops at various locations around Philadelphia followed classic surveillance detection routes designed to identify potential followers. His conversations with certain individuals employed verbal codes that suggested intelligence communication protocols. The most significant breakthrough came when surveillance teams identified Uncle Frank, the family friend who visited monthly for dinner. FBI facial recognition and background investigation revealed him to be Viktor Petrov, a known Soviet intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet consulate in New York. The monthly dinner visits were actually intelligence meetings disguised as social calls, with William's wife and son providing unwitting cover for espionage activities. David's role as an unwitting double agent within his own family proved psychologically devastating but operationally invaluable. He provided detailed intelligence about his father's behavioral changes, unexplained absences, and suspicious activities that external surveillance might miss. David reported when his father received certain phone calls, when he exhibited unusual nervousness, and when he made unexpected changes to family routines that might indicate operational activities. The strain on David was immediately apparent to Agent Kellerman. The young man lost weight, struggled academically, and displayed symptoms of severe stress as he maintained normal family relationships while secretly gathering intelligence against his father. Kellerman arranged for psychological support, but the fundamental contradiction of David's situation, loving and betraying the same person simultaneously, created psychological conflicts that no amount of professional help could resolve. The investigation revealed the true scope of William Morrison's intelligence gathering over 24 years. His position as an insurance adjuster had provided access to personal information about hundreds of Philadelphia area residents, including many employed by defense contractors. His social connections within the community had generated intelligence on local military installations, government facilities, and industrial operations. The accumulated intelligence represented one of the most comprehensive penetrations of an American community in espionage history. Electronic surveillance of the Morrison home proved technically challenging. William's professional paranoia meant the family residence was equipped with subtle countermeasures designed to detect listening devices. FBI technical specialists needed 3 weeks to install monitoring equipment that could operate undetected. The resulting audio intelligence provided crucial insights into William's communication methods, operational security measures, and psychological state. Margaret Morrison emerged as a tragic figure in the investigation. FBI analysis revealed that she had been completely unknowing about her husband's true identity and activities, yet her position at the Navy Yard and her social connections had made her an invaluable intelligence asset. Every detail she shared about her work, every piece of community gossip she repeated, every family friend she introduced to her husband had potentially served Soviet intelligence purposes. The evidence accumulated methodically, creating an overwhelming case against William Morrison, while simultaneously documenting the destruction his exposure would bring to everyone who had trusted him over more than 2 decades. The psychological warfare within the Morrison household intensified as winter deepened into early 1965. David maintained his role as loving son while secretly documenting his father's activities for the FBI. But the strain of living a double life began manifesting in ways that threatened the operation's security. His grades suffered, his behavior became erratic, and his interactions with his father took on a stilted quality that Margaret Morrison noticed with growing concern. William Morrison's operational instincts, honed by 25 years of deep cover work, began detecting subtle changes in his family's dynamics. David's questions had become more pointed, his interest in family history more persistent, and his casual observations more detailed than seemed natural for an 18-year-old. The veteran intelligence officer's paranoia, suppressed during years of comfortable suburban life, reasserted itself with increasing intensity. The surveillance teams documented William's growing anxiety through his behavioral changes. His surveillance detection routes became more elaborate, his social interactions more guarded, and his counter-surveillance measures more sophisticated. He began varying his daily routines unpredictably, taking circuitous routes to work, and conducting seemingly random errands that followed classic intelligence tradecraft for detecting followers. The FBI realized their target suspected something, though whether he suspected his son's betrayal or generic law enforcement interest remained unclear. Agent Kellerman faced a critical decision about the operation's timeline. The evidence against William Morrison was substantial, but not yet complete. The FBI wanted to identify his entire network, document his full range of activities, and potentially use him to expose other Soviet operations. However, William's increasing paranoia suggested he might attempt to flee the country or contact his handlers for emergency extraction. The investigation was becoming a race between evidence gathering and operational security. David's emotional deterioration created additional operational complications. During a February 1965 family dinner, he broke down and left the table when his father began discussing David's college plans with apparent genuine concern for his son's future. Margaret Morrison was bewildered by her son's behavior, but William Morrison's reaction was more calculating. His eyes followed David with the analytical gaze of a professional evaluating potential threats. The FBI's psychological assessment of David raised serious concerns about his ability to maintain his cover role. The young man was exhibiting symptoms of severe emotional trauma: insomnia, loss of appetite, difficulty concentrating, and episodes of intense anxiety. Agent Kellerman worried that David might inadvertently expose the investigation or, worse, suffer a complete psychological breakdown that would destroy the operation and endanger his own safety. Margaret Morrison became an unwitting barometer of the family's psychological pressure. Her conversations with neighbors and co-workers, monitored through electronic surveillance, revealed her growing concern about her husband's distant behavior and her son's apparent emotional problems. She attributed the family's stress to David's anxiety about college and William's work pressures, having no framework for understanding the espionage drama unfolding around her. The most dangerous moment came in March 1965, when William Morrison directly confronted David about his recent behavior. During a private conversation in the garage, recorded by FBI surveillance equipment, William asked pointed questions about David's school activities, social connections, and unexplained absences. David's responses, coached by Agent Kellerman, satisfied his father's immediate suspicions, but revealed the operational security risks inherent in the continuing investigation. The FBI realized that the operation was approaching its natural conclusion. William Morrison's suspicions were increasing, David's psychological state was deteriorating, and the evidence collected was sufficient for prosecution. The decision was made to move toward arrest, but the timing would need to be perfect. Too early and they might miss other Soviet operatives. Too late and their target might escape. The trap was closing, but everyone caught inside it would be destroyed in the process. On April 12, 1965, the carefully orchestrated surveillance operation reached its culmination when FBI teams observed William Morrison conducting what appeared to be an emergency meeting with his Soviet handler. The meeting occurred in Fairmount Park, using dead-drop techniques that confirmed his professional espionage training. William's behavior during the preceding days had suggested operational urgency. He had made encrypted radio transmissions, conducted extensive surveillance detection, and altered his normal routines in ways that indicated preparation for possible extraction. Agent Kellerman made the decision to accelerate the arrest timeline. William Morrison's increasing paranoia and apparent communication with Soviet intelligence suggested he might flee the country within days. The FBI had accumulated sufficient evidence for prosecution, identified key elements of his network, and gathered extensive intelligence about Soviet operational methods. Continued delay risked losing their primary target, while providing diminishing returns in additional intelligence. The arrest was planned for April 15, 1965, during William's morning commute to work. The location was chosen specifically to minimize trauma for Margaret and David Morrison. Arresting William at home would have created additional psychological damage for family members who had already suffered enormously. The FBI wanted to maintain some separation between William's criminal activities and the family environment where David and Margaret would need to begin rebuilding their lives. David Morrison's final briefing with Agent Kellerman was emotionally devastating. The young man who had walked into the FBI office 4 months earlier seeking to do his patriotic duty was now a psychologically shattered individual facing the imminent destruction of his family. Kellerman explained that David's cooperation had been essential for national security, but the personal cost had clearly exceeded anything either of them had anticipated. The morning of April 15th unfolded with terrible inevitability. William Morrison kissed his wife goodbye, ruffled his son's hair affectionately, and left for work as he had thousands of times before. David watched from his bedroom window as FBI agents surrounded his father's car, 3 blocks from their home. The arrest was professionally executed. No violence, no dramatic confrontation, just the quiet efficiency of law enforcement taking a dangerous criminal into custody. Margaret Morrison learned about her husband's arrest from Agent Kellerman's phone call 47 minutes later. Her reaction was immediate and complete denial. William Morrison was a loving husband and father, a respected member of their community, a refugee who had built a successful American life. The idea that he was a Soviet spy was incomprehensible, impossible, a mistake that would be corrected as soon as the FBI realized their error. The search of the Morrison home, conducted with Margaret's traumatized consent, revealed the full extent of William's deception. In addition to the documents David had discovered, FBI agents found sophisticated radio equipment hidden in the basement, coded communication materials concealed throughout the house, and financial records documenting 25 years of payments from Soviet intelligence. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. David's role in his father's exposure became apparent during the search when agents referenced his earlier cooperation. Margaret Morrison's reaction was a mixture of disbelief, horror, and rage. Her own son had betrayed his father to the authorities. The family structure that had provided stability for 18 years collapsed entirely in the space of a single morning, leaving mother and son psychologically devastated and permanently estranged. William Morrison's arrest made national headlines. The story of the Soviet deep-cover agent who had lived undetected in American suburbia for 25 years captured public imagination while highlighting the extent of Soviet intelligence penetration during the Cold War. The case became a symbol of the paranoia and suspicion that characterized American society during the peak years of superpower confrontation. But for David Morrison, the headlines represented personal catastrophe rather than national security victory. The trial of United States versus William Morrison began on September 7, 1965, in Federal District Court in Philadelphia, drawing unprecedented media attention as one of the most significant espionage cases in American history. Prosecuted under the Espionage Act of 1917, the case represented the government's opportunity to demonstrate the full scope of Soviet intelligence operations while simultaneously destroying the life of a man who had become genuinely American in every way except loyalty. David Morrison testified as the prosecution's primary witness, his voice barely audible as he described discovering the documents that had exposed his father's true identity. The courtroom was silent as the 18-year-old explained how he had made photocopies of Soviet intelligence materials and carried them to the FBI, knowing that his actions would result in his father's arrest and imprisonment. Defense attorneys portrayed David as a naive young man, manipulated by overzealous federal agents, but the evidence he had provided was too substantial to dismiss. Margaret Morrison attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row where her husband could see her unwavering support despite the overwhelming evidence of his deception. Her testimony revealed the devastating personal impact of the case. A 20-year marriage based entirely on fabricated identity, family memories that were simultaneously genuine and fraudulent, and the psychological trauma of discovering that her most intimate relationship had been an intelligence operation. The prosecution presented evidence spanning William Morrison's entire quarter-century in the United States. FBI surveillance had documented hundreds of intelligence transactions, thousands of dollars in payments from Soviet sources, and detailed records of information gathered about American defense installations and personnel. The scope of the operation was staggering. William Morrison had been one of the most productive deep-cover agents in KGB history. William's defense strategy focused on his transformation from Soviet operative to genuine American family man. His attorneys argued that whatever his original mission had been, he had abandoned espionage activities and embraced authentic American life. They presented witnesses who testified about his community involvement, charitable contributions, and evident love for his family. The defense portrayed him as a man trapped between competing loyalties who had chosen family over ideology. The most compelling testimony came from William Morrison himself. Speaking in the fluent English he had perfected over decades, he described his recruitment by Soviet intelligence, his training in Moscow, and his insertion into American society. But he also described falling in love with Margaret, the overwhelming emotion he felt when David was born, and his gradual psychological transformation from Mikhail Volkov into William Morrison. His testimony revealed the psychological complexity of long-term, deep-cover operations. William explained how maintaining false identity for 25 years had required him to suppress his authentic personality so completely that he had, in many ways, become the person he was pretending to be. His love for his family was genuine, even though the identity that made that family possible was entirely fabricated. The verdict was predetermined by the evidence, but the sentencing phase revealed the human tragedy underlying the espionage case. Federal prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing that William Morrison's activities had endangered American national security for more than 2 decades. Defense attorneys pleaded for life imprisonment, emphasizing his cooperation with authorities and the genuine rehabilitation evidenced by his family relationships. On November 18, 1965, Judge Harold Patterson sentenced William Morrison to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The sentence acknowledged both the severity of his crimes and the complexity of his personal transformation. William Morrison would spend the remainder of his life in federal prison, while Mikhail Volkov would effectively cease to exist. David Morrison watched his father receive a life sentence with the knowledge that his testimony had made the conviction possible. The aftermath of the William Morrison case created ripple effects that extended far beyond one family's destruction. David Morrison, unable to bear the weight of his community's mixed reactions, some viewing him as a patriotic hero, others as a son who had betrayed his father, left Philadelphia immediately after the trial's conclusion. He abandoned his college plans, enlisted in the Army under an assumed name, and spent 3 years in Vietnam trying to escape the psychological burden of his choices. Margaret Morrison never recovered from the revelation that her 20-year marriage had been an elaborate intelligence operation. She underwent intensive psychiatric treatment, but remained unable to reconcile the genuine love she had experienced with the calculated deception that had made it possible. She died in 1971 of what doctors termed a heart attack, but those who knew her understood that she had essentially died of a broken heart 6 years earlier. William Morrison served 18 years in federal prison before dying of cancer in 1983. Prison guards reported that he had been a model inmate who spent his time reading American literature and writing letters to family members who never responded. His final request was that his remains be buried in the cemetery where the real William Morrison lay, hoping that death might finally resolve the identity confusion that had defined his adult life. The FBI's investigation into William Morrison's network revealed the extent of Soviet intelligence penetration in American communities during the Cold War's height. Dozens of additional suspects were identified, leading to the exposure of one of the largest spy rings in American history. The case became a cornerstone of counterintelligence training, demonstrating how deeply foreign agents could integrate into American society while maintaining their ultimate loyalty to hostile foreign powers. David Morrison returned from Vietnam in 1969, a changed man, bearing psychological scars from both his war service and his family's destruction. He settled in Oregon under his real name, married a woman who knew nothing about his past, and worked as a carpenter for 37 years. He never spoke publicly about his father's case until 1995, when he granted a single interview to a journalist researching Cold War espionage, describing his decision as the most necessary and most regrettable action of his life. The case highlighted the human cost of intelligence warfare that extends far beyond the primary participants. Neighbors who had trusted William Morrison for decades questioned their ability to judge character. Children who had played with David Morrison grew up understanding that even the most intimate relationships could conceal fundamental deceptions. The community's faith in the authenticity of personal connections was permanently damaged. Intelligence historians consider the Morrison case a watershed moment in understanding the psychology of deep cover operations. William Morrison's genuine transformation from Soviet operative to American father demonstrated the unpredictable human elements that could undermine even the most carefully planned intelligence operations. His son's decision to expose him revealed that family loyalty, traditionally considered the strongest human bond, could be overcome by ideological conviction and patriotic duty. The broader implications for American society were profound. The Morrison case occurred during the peak years of Cold War paranoia, when American communities were already struggling with questions about loyalty, security, and the possibility that neighbors might be foreign agents. The revelation that a beloved family man had been conducting espionage for 25 years while maintaining seemingly authentic American life validated the deepest fears of a society under siege. David Morrison's final public statement about his father came in 2004, on the 40th anniversary of his decision to contact the FBI. He told a journalist that he still believed his actions had been necessary for national security, but that he had paid for that conviction with the loss of his family, his faith in human authenticity, and his ability to form trusting relationships. The price of doing right, he said, had been learning to live with the knowledge that love and betrayal could exist simultaneously in the same relationship, forever. The enemy had lived among them as family, and the only person who could stop him was the son who loved him most.